Okay, I'm going to say in the interest of time, because we've got a lot to cover, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jody Bechtel. I'm the Deputy Director of Clark County's Department of Environment and Sustainability. We're here today as the Division of Air Quality, one of our programs, to talk to you about rule development for the state implementation plan submission requirements for moderate non-attainment for the 2015 Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standard. This meeting is being recorded, so be aware of that. And it will be available for others to view or for you to review. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation on the screen. I'm just going to do a very quick overview so we can get to the kind of the meat and purpose of this meeting and talk about some of the rules we're looking into. Again, our department serves as the air pollution control agency for Clark County. And as I said, we're here to discuss the SIP rules that we are considering for ozone moderate non-attainment. On your screen here are some of the contacts that are dealing with the issue if you're interested in knowing who's who and who you might need to direct questions to. So in January of this year, we were notified that we were bumped up to moderate non-attainment for the 2015 ozone standard. We had a public meeting discussing the situation and what we're going to have to be doing to get back into attainment. So we were in marginal non-attainment for Araceli, can you please make sure people are getting admitted from the lobby? Just noticed some people are still getting stuck in the lobby. Okay, I'm sorry. So we were at marginal non-attainment when the standard was 75 parts per million, and when it was lower to 70 parts per million, we were bumped up to this moderate non-attainment standard. And like I said, I did a presentation in January. The recording is available on our website that goes into a lot more detail about the situation. I encourage you all to go look at that. We'll provide a link if you're wanting some more information on our background. And I did want to note for everyone that the EPA is in the process of reviewing the ozone standard again, and there is a likelihood that it could be lowered even further. But right now, we will just deal with the current 70 parts per million and moderate non-attainment standard. There we go. So really briefly, just the requirements under this new non-attainment situation is we must establish emission controls to get back into attainment and develop the state implementation plan. So we are required to come up or evaluate any reasonably available control technology or RACT requirements on our area sources. We are required to come up with a 15% reduction in volatile organic compounds. And those are independent of any reductions necessary to reach attainment. And then we're also required to come up with some contingency measures that we would trigger if by August of 2024, we are not in attainment with the moderate or 70 parts per billion standard, excuse me. And then, so this table on screen just kind of shows you the rules that we are considering and we'll be talking about again in more detail in this series of workshops. And then finally, for this quick intro, this table just identifies the statutory timelines we're working under. If you all participated in some of the previous workshops, you know that we were given a retroactive submission date for that SIP of January 1st. We were told that was our submission date on January 5th. So we are obviously in a retroactive situation. The EPA, Region 9, they're aware that the deadline was retroactive and is therefore unrealistic. We're working very closely with them and they know we're working in good faith to develop a SIP and some measures to get back into attainment as quickly as possible in this calendar year. Because we're working under a deadline that is passed, we need to get these controls in place as soon as possible. Of course, it's not a quick and easy process, but we are doing our best. And again, with that, we'll just move right into some of the rules that we're going to be talking about. And Araceli, I'm not sure who is first presenting, so I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce is it, I think it's Lynn presenting, but I'm not sure what rule. So I'll turn it over to Araceli Pruitt and she'll get us started. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to introduce Lynn Hutchison. She is with RTP Environmental, and she is the consultant working on helping us with some of the rules for this rulemaking effort. And the first one on the agenda for this morning is the degreaser rule. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Lynn.
So Araceli, I just noticed my share button is not active.
Green.
You're showing, I'm sharing the wrong screen. There we go. My goodness, you guys, I've got to get it together this morning. Okay, so while we're waiting for Lynn to sign back on, I did have this slide of the stakeholder meeting schedule that you should all be familiar with if you've registered for the workshops. So again, we're starting with degreasers. We'll talk about industrial cleaning solvents, industrial adhesives, miscellaneous metal and plastic parts, and graphic arts today. On the 13th, we'll talk about asphalt and gasoline dispensing facilities. And then we're still working on some additional rules that weren't quite ready to share in a more final draft form, consumer products and architectural industrial maintenance coatings, as well as figuring out what our contingency measures are going to be. The stakeholder meeting discussion recordings are at this link, and I will post this link in the chat as soon as I unshare my screen here. So thank you all.
I believe we're good now.
Yeah, we are. So let me go ahead and, oops, I need to launch again. All right, let me know when y'all can see the page.
It's up there.
All right. Okay, so the first thing, as Araceli said, that we're going to talk about is the metal solvent cleaning CTG, or AKA degreasing CTG. EPA issued the metal solvent cleaning CTG for degreasing units back in 1977. So it's a pretty old standard that EPA has on the books. The document sets forth recommended emission control requirements for what EPA refers to as presumptive RACT. You can find a copy of EPA's recommendations on their website, or contact us. We also had a link in the previous stakeholder presentations to this document. Unlike other CTG documents that EPA has published, EPA does not recommend specific emission limitations as part of their presumptive RACT requirement. Instead, they put forth equipment specifications and operating requirements for different types of degreasers. NAAQS rule would follow closely with EPA's recommendations, and it would affect a number of potential industries, including those that work with metal and use solvents to clean the parts. It generally falls under the SIC codes 25, 33, or 39, and SIC stands for Standard Industrial Classification Codes. Example industries, and this is not all inclusive, but just to give you a feel for the types of industries that would be potentially subject to DAQ's rule, is the automotive industry, electronics, appliances, furniture, jewelry, plumbing, metal fasteners, and metal fabrication and finishing. At our last stakeholder meeting, we discussed the possibilities of adopting a degreaser regulation to meet to meet contingency measures and ROP. And we talked about adopting the OTC Phase 2 rule. No decisions have been made on that at this point. And so this rule that we're talking about today does not talk about that OTC, or the ozone transport Port Commission rule, model rule, and solely talks about what EPA established as presumptive, reasonably available control technology requirements for the degreasing industry. Also, in our first stakeholder meeting, we went over types of degreasers and how emissions result from those operations. I'm not going to go into any detail on that today, and I'll refer you back to that first stakeholder meeting in order to get that information if you need it. So I'm going to skip through the next few slides. They're just here for your reference for information on the types of degreasers. Okay, before we talk about the CTG RACT rule, I did want to make you aware that Clark County already has a degreaser rule that applies as a matter of federal law. This is because it was approved by the US EPA into the Nevada State Implementation Plan years ago. But in 2011, Clark County removed the rule from its air quality regulations and does not enforce this rule as a matter of county rules anymore, but it still applies at the federal level. When DAQ promulgates or establishes the CTG RACT rule and submits it as part of a state implementation plan submission, it will also ask EPA to withdraw this old County Rule 6020 from the state implementation plan and replace it with the new CTG RACT rule. So the CTG RACT rule would apply to any owner and operator that runs a stationary source that emits greater than or equal to 3 tons per year of VOC from its metal solvent degreasing operations. And it would apply in areas that EPA has designated non-attainment and classified as moderate or higher classification. So currently that is HA 212, as Jody explained, but the rule is set up that should there be a future ozone standard and future designations by EPA of additional geographic areas for ozone non-attainment with a classification of moderate or higher, this rule would also apply in those areas. So EPA in their CTG document recommended 2 types of control systems for each of the degreasers. The first EPA called Control System A, and the second, which consisted of add-on equipment plus operating requirements, EPA named Control System B. In practice, most states adopted both systems of controls as RACT, and DAQ is also proposing to combine the systems for its CTG RACT rule. So for cold degreasers, the requirements would be to cover and operate with one hand, recycling a solvent draining off of the parts as it drips. You would have work practice requirements. You would have, could allow no more than 20% of your solvent to be lost in waste disposal. You would have to store and use a covered, non-absorbent, non-leaking containers to store your degreasing solvents. You would have to drain parts for at least 15 seconds. You would have to enclose the drainage system and use if you use highly volatile solvents in the operation, you would need to use a solid fluid stream on sprayers to prevent splashing. And there's also a requirement for controls specifications. Your freeboard ratio would have to be greater than or equal to 75. You would have to use a water cover or other equivalent systems of control, such as refrigerated chillers or carbon absorbers. Now, one thing that we asked at the first stakeholder meeting was for information on the population of degreasers actually in use in Clark County or HA 212. We didn't receive any of that information. We think, based on the information we have, that the majority, if not 100% of the degreasers in operation in Clark County are cold cleaners. So it is going to be these requirements that you see on this screen that apply to the majority of Clark County. But because we didn't get any response to our request for information on the types of degreasers, the rule does include requirements for open top degreasers and conveyorized degreasers as well. So vapor top degreasers would need to meet requirements similar to the cold cleaners. It would contain recommendations for better managing carryover emissions. These are the emissions that occur from drying of the parts after the parts are actually removed from the degreaser. And so there would be additional requirements that would apply for open top degreasers relative to these carryover emissions. It would also include a prohibition on the types of materials that can be used in a vapor top degreaser. So you couldn't degrease porous materials such as leather, cloth, wood, rope, or similar kinds of materials that could absorb the solvent materials. The rule would also require safety switches be used to handle such operating parameters as temperature and flow. And like the cold top degreasers, there would be design specifications for a greater than 0.75 freeboard ratio, use of a refrigerator, chiller, enclosed design, carbon absorbers, or an equivalent system of control. So the first work practice requirement for conveyorized degreasers would deal with those exhaust ventilation. This speaks to the ambient air that's around the degreaser. And for example, you couldn't use high-speed fans in the area to promote because this promotes a higher rate of evaporation. Other requirements would include that same no more than 20% of solvent lost in waste disposal. You need to repair leaks immediately or shut down. You would have to have no detectable water in solvent leaving the separator, and you would have control requirements similar as those for the vapor top degreasers. The rule does include a few exemptions from the requirements in the rule. These would include using only cleaning materials with VOC content of 0.21 pounds per gallon or less, complying with emission control requirements under 40 CFR Part 63 subpart T. That is a federal regulation that you find in EPA's hazardous air pollutant rules. If you use only vapor phase solder reflow units, then you would not be subject to this rule. And if you have a vapor air interface area of 1.0 square feet or less with a maximum solvent capacity of 1 gallon or less, then you would also be exempt from this rule. So I skipped over when we were going over the actual emission standards, but one thing I should note is that we are asking owners and operators to put a inspection and maintenance program into place to make sure that the operating requirements and design specifications are followed in the field. So you would have to conduct that inspection quarterly, at least quarterly, to assure compliance. There's also a registration requirement. If you're a stationary source that has the potential to emit greater than or equal to 3 tons per year of VOC, then no later than 180 days after the rule becomes effective, you are going to need to submit a registration. This registration basically lets DAQ know that you exist, that you are subject to the rule, and also provides information on your potential to emit and actual emissions. you'll need to update this registration annually. If information doesn't change, then you can just simply submit that no changes are relevant for your facility, but we think that probably you're going to have to report at least a change in your actual annual emissions annually. There are different compliance dates in the rule for existing versus new sources. Existing sources generally will have 180 days after the rule becomes effective, or in the very few circumstances that you would actually be constructing a degreaser unit when the rule becomes effective, you would have up until the time that you commence normal operations to comply. Or if you currently are not subject to the rule, perhaps because you have a PTE less than 3 tons per year, but in the future you increase your PTE, then you're going to have to comply immediately with the rule. New sources, or those which begin construction after the effective date of the rule, would have to comply with the rule when they commence normal operations. Now, we realize that the time frame that DAQ has undertaken to promulgate and put these rules into place is not ideal. And therefore, we also have included the ability for the control officer to grant an alternative compliance date in the rule. This could be done by submitting a permit application requesting an alternative compliance date. In that application, you would have to justify that alternative date based on technical feasibility and time needed to comply. If DAQ agrees, they'll issue a permit with an alternative compliance date, and if they do not, they will deny it. At any rate, submitting the permit application will give you an alternative compliance date until DAQ acts on your application to approve or deny it. So that pretty much sums up the rule for metal degreasing, and I will turn it back over to Araceli for questions and follow-up.
Hello, everyone. I want to take this opportunity to address any questions that anybody on the line has. You can feel free to raise your hand, and I will enable your microphone and your camera if you wish to be on camera, or you can just go ahead and type them in the chat and we'll get to you. So we'll give it a minute or two to see if there are any questions. I'm not seeing any questions, nor I'm not seeing any hands raised to ask a question. So I will go ahead and give a closing presentation on the next steps. Bear with me for one moment. Oh, there is a question that's coming in from Cheryl Evans. She asks, what about units that are insignificant?
Okay, so the concept of insignificant is not relevant for the reasonably available control technology standards. Basically, you are subject to the rule if in total your degreasing operations at your stationary source exceed that 3 tons per year potential to emit. So all of your degreasing operations would need to comply with the standard.
And Elizabeth Jamie is asking, is this for gas stations also?
So Ted is going to go over regulations for gas stations in the future. If you have degreasing units at your gas stations, I assume that's what you're asking about. Again, if you're above 3 tons per year, yes, the standard would apply to you.
Gary Jones is asking, why is the threshold 3 tons per year potential and not actual?
So EPA had actually recommended a 3-ton per year potential to emit in their presumptive RACT rule. Now, in the actual regulatory language, and I don't think I went over this, or perhaps I skipped it, we do have a allowance for sources that emit less than 3 tons per year for 3 consecutive years. If you demonstrate that you have emitted below 3 tons per year for 3 consecutive years, then you would not need to comply with the design specification requirements in the rule. You would have to submit notice, and you would have to submit your annual emissions to DAQ, but you would not be subject to the control standards unless and until you exceeded that 3 ton per year in your actual emissions.
Do we have any other questions? Gary Jones is asking, would the notices have to be submitted annually?
Yes. Recently, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency denied a SIP rule in Colorado because it allowed owners and operators to maintain information on site with no requirements to submit information. And because of that, and because DAQ would like this process in submitting rules to EPA to be as seamless as possible, they have included a requirement to submit an update to the registration annually, and to submit, if you're that 3 ton per year source, you're relying on less than 3 tons per year to submit your annual emissions.
Are there, Gary Jones is saying, since most sources in this category are small, is there going to be a streamlined process?
Gary, could you elaborate on that question a little bit more as far as what you are looking for or thinking about as far as streamlining goes?
I can go ahead and unmute you, Gary, and enable your microphone so that you can speak directly. Let me find you on my list here. Gary, you should be able to go ahead and use your microphone.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great, awesome. All right, much better than doing the posting the messages through the chat. Well, my thought process is that some of our members may qualify if they have these degreaser and they're going to be less than 3 tons. So most of these facilities are not sophisticated and don't have EHS professionals. So if they have to do an annual submission to the county to maintain their status as exempt, there has to be an easy way to do that. They can't get, a 15-page form to fill out every year to do that. Is there a streamlined process that could be done, say, online, or like in the form of a 1-page? There may be other requirements that
Right.
could apply coming with
Right.
all the
It is DAQ's intent to make this as easy and pain-free as possible. They're really hoping to set up a registration database online before all these rules become effective. But as you know, there's time crunches. So I'm not going to sit here and promise you an online system, but I can tell you that DAQ does have that in the back of the mind, where somebody could just log in and submit, here's our update, 3 tons per year, and be done with it. That is what DAQ would like to get into place. If not, it's going to be a paper submission, but we don't envision it being anything long. It would be, I'm an owner and operator, I've claimed this exemption, I continue to claim the exemption, here's my annual emissions, and be done with it.
Okay, so you say, the annual emissions just from the parts washer. See, is this a new change in EPA's policy to have an annual reaffirmation? Because in other states that have done these RACT rules, they've had a one-time notification. In other words, a source had to say,
Right.
hey, I'm subject to this RACT rule. I'm going to do these things to meet it. Or if they're not subject to it, they would just notify that they're not subject, but then there's no annual requirement for them to come back and say, I'm continually exempt from this requirement. That seems a little like overkill.
Yes, and please put that in your written comments to us on this rule. It is something new, like hot off the press as of 1 month ago in the Colorado SIP action. And so it put DAQ in a very precarious situation, knowing that Region 8 denied and actually denied approval of a Colorado SIP because records were kept on site. And it's been, a frenzy situation to try to figure out what that means for other regional offices, whether that's going to be consistently applied policy across all the regions, whether this was driven by a public information comment on the Region 8 submittal. So it is a moving target at this point. And because DAQ didn't know where that target is going to land, and because we are in this time crunch to get things that are approvable to Region 9, we went ahead and included this requirement. Now, additional discussions with the region or, great comments from the public as to why this would be an overly onerous requirement could cause DAQ to reconsider it and take the issue up in more detail with the region. So that's the best I can tell you at this point. Please give us information on your comments on this requirement, and they will be fully considered as we move forward.
Yeah, I think we definitely got to submit the comment. I missed the very, very beginning. Or maybe that's what Araceli is going to cover. When's this going to be released for a proposal, and when is the comments going to be due?
I'll talk about that in a minute or two,
Okay.
Gary.
Right, no problem. Okay,
And
yeah, because that's really onerous for small sources to do it annually. I mean, I can see a one time, but to do an annual, because they're going to forget.
Yeah. Yeah, and honestly, we thought about, well, maybe we make it biannual, or we make it, triannual requirement, trying to satisfy EPA in some manner. And the gut feeling was, if it wasn't annual, it's going to be more likely forgotten than, if we move to a lower frequency of resubmittal of the information. So any solutions, any recommendations you have would be most welcome.
I do have a question, and I don't know the answer to this, but does Clark County require their sources to submit an annual VOC emission inventory?
Araceli, you want to field that one? I'm pretty sure you do, but I think there's a lower threshold cutoff.
I'm sorry, I thought I was on mute. The person I would have answer that question is not on the line. Let me see if I can get Scott Jelinek, one of our compliance folks, to a supervisor to address that question. Scott,
Hi.
I'm going to enable your microphone. Are you able, or is this Shibby? You can answer that?
Yeah. Good morning.
Okay.
This is Shibi Paul, Compliance Manager. I can answer that question. Yes, all the permitted sources, an annual emission inventory reporting requirement. If you are permitted under our minor source permitting rule, by March 31st of every year, you had to submit annual emission inventory, which includes VOC emissions as well. Did that answer your question, Mr. Jones?
Yes, well, I think if you already have that annual reporting requirement, maybe you could incorporate this if you're going to go ahead with it. But the sources that don't have to get a permit, what's the threshold for permitting?
5 tons for VOCs.
Right. So you'd have sources that would be under that theoretically if this was their only source, so they wouldn't be caught. But if you could add something to that emission inventory as a checkbox, that would make it easier for sources that would qualify but still have to submit something. Just a thought.
That's a great suggestion. I suggest you to put that in the comments, and we'll definitely will consider that suggestion.
Okay, great.
And
I think that's all my questions. You can mute me again.
oh, thank you, Gary. I'm going to go ahead and open the floor to Cheryl Evans. She has a question. Let me enable your microphone. And if you want to, your camera, Cheryl, you should be able to speak. But if you are speaking, we can't hear you.
Yes.
You can't hear me?
There she is. There she is. Yeah.
Okay, question, as a Title V source, we have that threshold under the 2.5 rule that makes us insignificant activities. So and that's why I asked the question about insignificant. That threshold is a lot stringent than the threshold for the RACT, for this RACT, this regulation that you're trying to propose. So if we qualify for that, could that be our exemption?
No, there is going to be no relationship to the insignificant qualifications under Title V and this reasonably available control technology. You're going to have to comply with this rule irrespective of what designation you are currently under Title V.
But if our actuals are below, we can show our 3 years actuals to show that we are below the 3 tons.
Okay.
Okay. Well, then we'll submit that documentation then.
Okay.
For our source.
And Araceli, Jody made a comment in the chat that was kind of relevant to Gary's last question. She said, once we have the registration system up and running, they can actually send the reminders out to folks who are in the system that they have to update.
Great, thank you, Jody. Our next session is scheduled to start at 9:15, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. Let me share a couple of my slides with you all. Can you see that?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so this is the rulemaking timeline that we're working with. So obviously today's workshop, and then we're holding more workshops for other rules that are part of this effort on July 13th. And we intend to start public comment on September 3rd. And then that would end on October 3rd. And then we would go to present the rule to the Board of County Commissioners on November 21st. And the rule would become effective on December 5th. The rule effective date is 2 weeks after adoption by the Board of County Commissioners, and the compliance dates are specific to each rule and are based on the rule effective date. And Lynn talked about those compliance dates in her presentation on this rule. And the next steps are, we're going to consider comments received today and any additional written comments received through July 27th. Send any written comments to me, and this is your opportunity to give us feedback and help us make this a rule that works for everybody. Those who have registered for this mailing list and for our mailing list and for the workshop should receive updates on these rules and our attainment plan. Like I said earlier, the proposed rule will be released for 30-day public comment, followed by a public hearing for final adoption. And on this slide, I am showing you a link to register for our mailing list and also a link to follow the developments of our attainment SIP. And just in closing, we want to say that we're going to continue to engage industry stakeholders and the public in our rulemaking process. Any questions related to these efforts can be sent to me, Araceli Pruitt. Modeling questions can be sent to Jung Lee. And we'll any questions that you have, you can send them to me and I'll get them to the individual that can help answer those questions. And again, please sign up for our distribution list if you have not already done so, so you can continue to receive updates on these efforts. That's all I have for you today. let me see. Does anybody else have anything to present before we close this meeting? I'm not hearing anything. Again, just please continue to follow the developments of our plan, and we will update you as this rulemaking process goes forward. And again, please send any written comments that you have by July 27th. We'd really like to get a great rule in place before we send it out for public comment.
And Araceli, did you mention that an actual draft of the rules is available online?
Oh, no, thank you, Lynn. Thank you for the reminder. And you can, on the link provided on the previous slide, you can find draft rules for each of the rules that we're presenting at these workshops. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close the presentation so that we can get started on the next one, which is industrial cleaning solvents. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance.